Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. To all our sisters here and to those that are linked through the Hilaal TV. I think we've got the graveyard run. That's myself and Sister Zohra Sooliman. But let's hope that you are still able to sustain your attention and energy levels. Sister Fatima spoke about a sugar rush. I think I've got a caffeine rush here. I'm jittering, not because I'm nervous. I should not have had that cup of coffee this morning. Anyway, so our topic is the the topic is voices of Muslim women in polygynous marriages in Durban and surrounding areas, a lived reality. I have not approached this topic from the religious perspective. I do not want to get into the debate of whether it's allowed or not allowed. All I'm here is to report what the women in these marriages experience on a day-to-day level. So the aim of the study was to gain a deeper understanding of the study participants, namely in relation to their core experiences, the consequences that they have to live with, and the unique experiences of first wives in polygynous families and second wives in polygynous families. I wanted to have both the first and the subsequent wives, and because I wanted to have a balanced view. So, well, I've just mentioned that. So, what is the typical experience of Muslim women in South Africa who are in polygynous marriages? So from the first wife's perspective, they highlighted that they saw it as a betrayal after a long marriage. A marriage for some of them was over 20 years, some into 30 years, and some nearly reaching 40 years. It was a long-term investment in the husband, the children, the in-laws, the business, and supporting their husbands' careers. And they had put their own personal aspirations on the back burner while they were in this marriage. Again, the fact that these marriages were conducted in secret and the women discovered much later into the marriage that their marriages had turned polygynous, and that too through the grapevine, or maybe through some suspicion and then direct confrontation to their spouse. They had seen a change in behavior. They had noticed that there were lots of lies, inconsistencies in what the husband was telling them. There were omissions. So, you know, the husband just said, well, I didn't say anything, or I didn't tell you that. So omissions, you know, they justified their actions by not saying certain things. And then, of course, there are lots of dishonesty. The husband's callous response to their wives was, when they inquired, why didn't you tell me? Or how come I get to know through so-and-so, or so late into the marriage? I mean, you've been married all this time. I sleep next to you, I wake up next to you, and I don't know you have another life and another wife. So, so they said they would inform the wife when they thought the time was right. And of course, that causes a huge fracture and rupture in the relationship, because when we make that nikah, it's a covenant and a trust that is there between the husband and the wife. And when such betrayal takes place, and it's just inconceivable how the men cannot think that if they plan to pursue be in the nikah of the first wife and family, how can there be a betrayal which ruptures the relationship and then you still expect it to go on? So it was the destruction of the foundation of these marriages. And the wives felt that they were subjugated by their husbands. When the first wife approached the husband, his response was he did not default, because Islam allows a man to have 4 wives at one time, and that it is a sunnah practice. And also that the wife's permission was not required. The wives were aware of the rule and they understood it. And they knew that polygyny was permitted in Islam. It's an ancient practice. In fact, Islam came to reform the practice. Previous to the time of Islam, the Jahiliyyah community used to have, endless number of wives and concubines, and they didn't even know who their children were or how to track their families. But Islam came and reformed this practice by limiting it to 4 wives at any one time. So the women said they also observed that although the husband said that it was their right because Islam allowed 4 wives and that it was the practice of the Prophet ﷺ, but these husbands were not particularly religious. So, they justified their actions, but they didn't see that their husbands were, sort of overly religious. And all of them that I saw, that I had interviewed, all had illicit affairs. So all these relationships started on not a halal foundation. It was through a secret relationship that's been going on for some time, in some cases years, and eventually the husband, Allah gave hidayat, and the husband made the nikah to give that wife honor and to not, if adultery, it destroys the moral fabric of any society. So when they eventually solemnized these relationships, these marriages, the nikahs, right? It was done in secret. So if nikah, just question yourself now. If nikah is an Islamic concept, it's an Islamic act, and if polygyny is also allowed, then why would people be doing it in secret? And why is there that underhandedness where the wife has no idea of what's happening and she's always the last to come to know? And what about the second wives whose agreeability to this? I mean, when they and the husband are negotiating this relationship and the formalizing of the relationship, how do they agree with it, knowing that they're going into another family and disrupting that family system? So, and some of my participants called it halal prostitution. So the other theme that came up was the husband's unfair division of time, resources, and the rights of the wife. So the first wives reported that the husbands were lavish on the second wife. The one participant, in fact, related that if they were in a shop somewhere, the husband would buy something. If he was with his first family, he would buy something for the second wife, and in this case, it was an item of jewelry. And when the children said to the dad, "Will you not buy for mom?" And he says, "No, I don't have any money for I can't buy 2. So he's buying, and that was in the presence of his first wife and first family. How demeaning, how hurtful is that? So the other aspect that they reported on was that they deprived them of their personal needs and they stopped the financial contributions to the household. From the second wife's perspective, one of my participants reported that she was forced to waiver her rights of inheritance upon her husband's death. He made her sign a legal document that said that upon my death, you will not get anything and you must accept that because everything will go to my wife and my first family. And we know what that is in Islam. It's a grave sin and an injustice and an oppression. They reported that they were not taken out on outings and holidays. Sometimes the first family were taken out more visibly theirs had to be more secret, and they didn't go out as many times or have so many overseas trips as the first family did, as compared to what they were given. The unequal division of time. So if this marriage had taken place in secret and the wife doesn't know, the reason she doesn't know is because the routine has been the same. He comes home every day, he leaves home every day like nothing, there's no change in his routine. So, which means that he was not giving the subsequent wife the time equally according to the way it is stipulated in the Quran. So there again, he was defaulting. But remember when he was asked, why did you enter into polygyny? He said it was a sunnah practice. So the second wives told me that their husbands default on a daily basis. In fact, even the first wife said that to me. The irony was, like I said, they justified their subsequent marriages because it was allowed, but equal and fair and just treatment of the wives, the religion had no application there. And Allah says clearly in the Quran, in Surah Nisa, verse 3, and if you fear that you cannot do justice to orphans, marry women of your choice, 2 or 3 or 4. But if you fear that you shall not be able to treat them justly, then marry only one. That will be more suitable for you to prevent you from evil. Now, despite this precondition, many men engage in polygyny, considering it a privilege. And Allah says in the verse, in the same surah, verse 129, so which means the warning is very, very clear, while in the same verse, Allah permits the practice of polygyny. At the same time, He also says, if you cannot do justice, then He says, then marry one. And it says here, sorry, I'm just looking for that verse. You will never be able to treat your wives with equal fairness, however much you may desire to do so. Allah is saying that to us in the Quran, that even if you want to, you've got the best of intentions, you will not be able to be fair. However you may desire to do so, but do not ignore one wife altogether, leaving her suspended between marriage and divorce. If you make amends and remain conscious of God, He is most forgiving and merciful. So a lot of the study participants here were not married, but they were not divorced either. And then the other theme that came out, that the first wives felt abandoned. Their husbands stopped spending on them and withdrew from their responsibilities of household expenses. So participant B, I mentioned that to you, where he was buying a gift in her presence, and when the kids asked, I told you that already. Participant C was more concerned over survival. Her husband withdrew from paying the household expenses, lights, water, rent, and children's expenses. He sold the car. She was a madrasa teacher. She had to now take a kumbi or a taxi to go to madrasa. And she had to go and appeal to organizations for zakat, hampers, food hampers, for support for her children. So an act that Allah has permitted, a practice that Allah has permitted and is a sunnah, but if it reduces the woman to have to go and beg from relief organizations, then there's something wrong with the way it is being practiced. Participant D, a first wife, she was thrown out of the house. He changed the locks and he held her belongings. When she came to me, I saw her, I think it was a year or 15 months after it had happened. And she said to me she had the few belongings in a checkers packet, and she ended up going to her parents' home, who are elderly and frail and sick, but she had nowhere else to go. And they were living in the small house, and I think it was like a small stoop it was a covered stoop where she was now, that was her bedroom. And she worked in his business. He was running a shop that she worked in right from day one, building up the business. During the marriage, he used to find it difficult to provide everything in the house. She used to go and ask her parents and pay for a lot of the expenses in their marriage. But when she left, when he threw her out of the marriage, he did not give her any compensation for working the 19 years in his business. And like I said, she was forced to move to her elderly parents. And then eventually she got a job with a very meager salary. So the Sharia rule states that the husband is liable for all marriage expenses. Whether you're in a monogamous marriage or a polygynous marriage, the husband is responsible for household expenses, for all expenses to cover the household, the needs of the wife, and the needs of the children. Now, when a man who intends marrying more than one wife, he must have the financial means to attend to the needs of all his wives. And the standards that the first family were living at, they should not be reduced. So there is a qualifier. Can you be fair? Can you be just? Can you provide for them financially, socially, emotionally, physically, economically? And I always add, if all of those things are not right, then you're also depriving them spiritually. So the first wives, because of all of this, because the polygyny is not practiced according to Quran and Sharia and Sunnah, so it affects the wives. It has an emotional and a psychological impact on them. And this is both first and second wife. Quite often we have this stereotype that the second wife comes in when the husband is quite established in his life, he's much more wealthy, she doesn't have to tolerate in-laws or have to cook for large sums of people and things like that. But having interviewed the wives and got the perspective of the second wife, they had their own share of difficulty in the polygynous marriage. So we're doing first wives now, the psychological and emotional impact on them. Participant A said that she was in a state of shock when her husband revealed his subsequent marriage to her 6 months later. She had suspected something because she was working with him in the business, and so was the second wife. So she was also working in the accounts department or as a receptionist or whatever. They both were sitting with their desks next to each other. And there were certain things that she was observing that made her suspicious that maybe her husband was married to this woman. And he was increasingly getting irritated, annoyed, and agitated with her presence in the business. And this other woman would constantly go into her husband's office and talk. And so she had, there was some suspicion that something is going on. He was so unkind and rude to her. Because she suspected it, he was arrogant, defensive, and said a lot of nasty things and mean things to her. And she lost 10 kgs over a period of 6 months. Participant B was very angry and sad with frequent crying spells. She says that she used to cry until she could cry no more. Participant D, that was the one that I saw after 15 months of her incident, and she sobbed throughout the interview. When we finished off with that interview, I was quite exhausted. because it was her first chance to talk about it and to actually hear herself say what happened to her. And she said that his second wife, her husband's second wife, made her look as the insignificant wife, despite her being the first wife and being 19 years in the marriage, stood alongside her husband and built his business up. But she looked at her as though she was insignificant and as though the second wife was the important one. So she used the word like I was the side chick. And she said, I'm a train wreck. And she just felt that, she was suffering such agony and felt forsaken by her husband by no action of her own. She was not guilty of anything. In the second marriage, and this was her opinion, that second marriages are imposed on the first wife. You have to share a husband against your will. This is not what you bargained for 20, 30, 40 years ago. So when it happens, it's imposed on you. From the second wife's perspective and the emotional and psychological impact on them, participant E said her husband was unfair. She's the one who said that she doesn't get taken to overseas holidays. She doesn't get taken out on local outings. He comes to live with her in her house on the times that he has to give to her, but it's not fair, it's not equal. We all know that with the recent situation in the country, we've all had to, spruce up our security. She asked him to build a fence around her house. He refused. And her car, she says, is an old scorrer that doesn't even drive. Water comes in when there's rain. He didn't even want to buy her a decent, even if you could call it a second-hand car or a Toyota, if we could call it a simple car. But his wife was driving around a R1 million worth SUV. And participant F reported that on the day of her husband's funeral, her mother-in-law said that she must leave the house. And all she could think about was the 13 years that she took care of her sick husband and neglected her own business, her beauty salon. And she said the family accepted her then. Nobody said they're going to have a daycarer or anything like that. They didn't help them financially. Somehow she managed to eke out her living and pay for the medical expenses. And she says she was more perceived as a maid by her mother-in-law, which upset her and hurt her tremendously. And in the end, the wives had concluded that both wives are affected physically, emotionally, and psychologically. So just like Dr. Safia Ibrahim had mentioned, that when we are experiencing any kind of grief or depression, and I would put this under grief, grief of your marriage as you knew it, grief of your spouse who is still alive, and now you got to share him with another woman. And so it affected her obviously emotionally. It affected all the wives emotionally, but with the loss of weight and with the constant crying and feeling abandoned, feeling punished for something you didn't do. I mean, all of those things will bring up emotions in you that will eventually manifest into physical disease if it's not treated. And most studies on polygynous marriages, especially ones in the Middle East, had reported depression, OCD, paranoia, anxiety, and those were the mental health conditions that were identified in that study. The first wife feels cheated on, replaced, and like she's past the sell-by date. And then both wives feel jealous, insecure, and the pain of sharing a common husband. So women subjugating women. Participant E, who was a second wife, she said that the first wife was smearing her reputation in public. Now remember I said to you She said she wasn't taken out on overseas holidays, local outings. Her car wasn't fixed or replaced, and neither was her house security upgraded. So this first wife told her husband that, you know, this woman is only there for your money. And once she gets what she wants, she's just going to leave you high and dry, and she'll leave you. And then she made rumors that people came to tell her about the second wife, and she was tainting her character and reputation, that she's a loose woman and things like that. So yes, the woman subjugating woman is very, very rife as well in polygynous marriages. Sometimes it's the other way around, like we saw in the other first wife's case, where the second wife treated her as though she was insignificant. In this case, it was the first wife who treated the second wife in a very negative way. She casted doubts about her to her husband. She even went to the extent of involving Maulanas to break the marriage. And this woman said to me at one stage, her nikah was broken, and then she didn't know where she stood. Does she serve iddah? And then eventually she went and spoke to one of the Maulanas at one of our religious bodies, and she said, she gave her side of the story. And the Maulana said what happened was absolutely wrong, unjust, and that the nikah was not, the talaq was not valid. And so she was still in her husband's nikah. But we can see that the woman's anger, the woman who's the first wife, she is so angry and she's taking out her revenge on the second wife. So, that also is not correct. And on another topic, like any other test that befalls us, and from what Dr. Ibrahim has spoken about, Quraisha mentioned early this morning, what is our true purpose in life? At the end of the day, this is a spiritual journey. So all the ornaments of the world are just here, and it's temporary, and it's actually distractions to take us away from the real purpose of going to Allah and living for the akhirah. And so, like any other negative event or that happens, a crisis that happens in your life, very much this becomes a spiritual journey for yourself. If you introspect and you reflect on what has happened, and you think later on in retrospect, this was Allah's way of bringing you back to the path and rerouting your journey. So yeah, when the wives are subjugating each other, that is not, it's not a good thing. In the second wives, women subjugating women, participant F's mother-in-law, which I mentioned earlier, she said to her, do not put foot into this house after the mayyat leaves. Family members must cease all communication with her. She was not regarded as her husband's legitimate wife upon his death. And her mother-in-law never accepted her from the beginning. That's what she actually said. And she was the stigmatized second wife. So it's not just the husband's ill treatment or the first wife's ill treatment to the second wife or vice versa. There's also the dynamics of religion, the dynamics of society, the dynamics of culture. All of those have an interplay with the way polygyny is accepted or not accepted and the way it is practiced. And we know that second wives are not regarded as legitimate wives despite them making a nikah, but you all must be aware of the new Concord ruling about the Muslim marriage bill. Our marriages are now recognized, whether they are polygynous or not. So the aversion to the practice of polygyny, when they were asked this question, what they thought of polygyny. So the first wife said that despite it being practiced in South Africa, it's not accepted as the norm, like in North African countries and in Middle Eastern countries. And participant D said she was the first wife, that Muslims we are socialized in South Africa. We live between the intersection of being Muslim, following our religion, but also being brought up in a Western culture. And the Western culture has a monogamous model of marriage. So the above cultures, the older wife will choose the co-wife. But in South Africa, we can't relate to that. Participant B said that she was always against the idea of polygyny because of the pain and injustice that it caused women. And participant E, a second wife, advised against polygyny because she said to protect you from the heartache and pain, acknowledging that it is painful for both first and second wives. And research question 2, what are the negative consequences of living in a polygynous marriage? Their husbands did not participate with them and their children as a member of the family. They did not take them on outings. I mentioned that. They appeared grumpy, avoided them and found fault with them, preoccupied with their phones, laptop, and occupied themselves with work. And there was a huge disappointment from the first wives in general when they said that the husbands excluded them from critical decisions compared to as before the subsequent marriage. And many of these decisions impacted their life and the lives of their children. Their children became quiet and withdrawn. They could not relate to their fathers in the same way as before. In general, children became rebellious and disobedient. They resorted to smoking, taking drugs, listening to loud music. The one mother said her 2 boys were Hafiz, and it was upsetting her tremendously that they have Quran in their heart, but they're listening to this loud music that was more disturbing to the soul than anything else. The first wives reported that they felt like single parents. Participant A said that her teenage son he was a teenager at the time of the interview, but he was psychologically affected because from the age of about 6, he witnessed constant arguing between the parents while the husband was having an affair. Participant B said that her children were angry they were at their father because they were hurt at what he did to their mother, and they did not want her to care for him as she did. She was still caring for him like the traditional wife. The first wife feels physically married and emotionally divorced. So remember, we said they are not married, but they're also not divorced. So participant A, she said the distance between her and her husband was like there's a wall between us. Participant B said there's no emotional attachment between us. There's no marriage between us. She is just her husband's maid, and so she's shut herself off emotionally from him. Participant C said that she was only concerned about security and stability. So they share the same roof with the husband, but they live their separate lives, separate bedrooms, separate lives. He's most welcome to come and eat when he's there, join the family for supper, but other than that, they had very separate lives. The other theme that came up was the first wife's disempowering dependence on the husband's finances for sustenance and survival. So some of the reasons that she had to stay in this marriage, that she had to accept the situation that was imposed upon her, was the lack of financial independence, lack of skills to secure a job, years of caring for the children, extended families, and her domestic responsibilities made her unemployable, and also she didn't pursue a career of her own, and that's why was unable to pick up from anywhere to get a job or to become independent. The stability and the financial security for the children and their education was one of the reasons that they were forced to stay in the marriage. And of course, the roof over their heads, why first wives are forced to stay in the marriage against their will and tolerate the injustice. Research question 3, what were the unique experiences of first and second wives? The first wives said that they never expected that their husbands would marry subsequent wives. Never ever through the marriage period did they think that after 20, 30, even 40 years, their marriages would turn polygynous. State of shock, disbelief, hurt. They felt heartlessly rejected. The secrecy, lies, deception surrounding the subsequent marriages created a breach of trust, commitment between the original couple, and they saw it as a betrayal. And I know I've seen many of those couples, more the wife, and they've had to rework their marriages. It was when the husband married the subsequent wife, he divorced the first wife technically, and then they had to make re-nikah in the symbolic term, and then rework the relationship to a point of trust, if that was at all possible. It was straining and disrupting the marriage relationship moving forward, which is what I just discussed. And emotionally, they were disconnected, unable to show affection towards their husbands. You must know this conversation is running in their head all the time about why he married the other woman. Was there something wrong with me? I stood by him. I made the sacrifices. And now at this stage of our life, when we are supposed to be enjoying our our advanced adulthood years, now he decides to marry somebody, and now the first wife has to deal with it. And so there was a lot of dissatisfaction in the marriage. And the second wives are perceived as the devil's advocates in the promotion of the practice of polygyny. The second wives said that they had to actually rethink their stance due to their negative experiences. When they got in, they thought they were from previous marriages, widowed or divorced, or had a bad abusive relationship in the previous marriage, and thought this was a second chance. They had children from the first marriage, so they thought a polygynous marriage would help to give them that security so that they didn't have to strive to the point where they were neglecting their children. And but once they were in the marriage, they said they had to rethink their stance. Husband's original family are not receptive to kind and friendly gestures from the subsequent wife. And the inequality and the injustice by their husbands, it made them rethink. And the disregard for their feelings and lack of respect by their husbands, his original family, and the community. The second wives stigmatized for being second wives. So despite Islam permitting polygyny and marriages being solemnized by nikah, their reputations were tainted and slandered against, accused of trapping their husbands into marriage, marrying into established monogamous marriages to benefit from their husband's wealth, rejection of the second wife and no communication. Most times you'll find that the second wife, she doesn't go to the common mall. She has to go to like a suburban mall. She'll have to go to a restaurant which is like not commonly attended by the community. So she's always in the background. An exclusion from husband's estate, and we know the rights of inheritance, and if those are not divided equitably and according to the Sharia, the importance of a will is so important, so emphasized in Islam. But to remove the wife from that right of inheritance, that is a grave sin that they're going to have to answer to Allah. And the second wives not considered as legitimate wives. So I'll skip this one. So the implications for women who choose to become second wives. Second wives were also adversely affected from a physical, emotional, and psychological perspective. They face the stigma of being labeled second wives. Women who fall in love with married men or marry them for financial security and other gains that go with it must be prepared to suffer the associated repercussion that the study has revealed. But it doesn't have to be so. And you'll hear later. So the recommendations are that there needs to be an educational approach in mosques, madrasas, halaqah, Islamic print media, Islamic radio stations, and other social media platforms. The imams must do extensive education to men and women who approach them to perform the nikah. So before that imam solemnizes that nikah, he must make sure that all bases are covered. Is this man, how is he going to see to his original family? How is he going to see to the second wife? and all the rules and the mundane day-to-day activities, but it needs to be done in a just, fair, and equitable way. There has to be transparency in the practice. It should not just be encouraged, but it should be ensured. And I think that's a big responsibility on the imams. Muslim men and women in society should become aware of the core lived realities of living in polygynous marriages. So no one talks about it. It's a topic everyone shies away from. The imam doesn't want to talk about it from the mosque mimbar, because then it will look like he's encouraging it. But the incorrect practice is causing so much of suffering and disruption in family lives and manifesting in mental health conditions. So it needs to be re-looked at and transformed the way it's being practiced. So the whole reason why they should intervene is to prevent oppression on women and their children, and to correct the behavior and the attitudes where it is needed. And that means at all levels, at a family level, societal level, the religious leaders level, and the community as a whole, and the way we look at it. Husbands and wives, including first and subsequent wives, from Muslim polygynous marriages should come forward and share their experiences, both the negative and positive, on various platforms. And some of us have seen some of those videos on YouTube. And I think there was a couple that was doing road shows in South Africa, and the first and the second wife, and they were sharing their experiences. So we need more of those. Men and women, after knowing all this information, should make informed decisions and practice caution if they wish to enter a polygamous marriage. And women need to know about the contract. The contract has been there from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. His daughters, the Sahaba of the time, they all entered into contracts about simple things like how often would they visit their parents, where would they want to live. I think it was Bibi Aisha that said she wanted to live next to her father, her parents' home, and one of the Sahaba moved out of the house where it was near the Prophet's home and allowed her parents to live there so she could have that clause in her contract honored. And something that I learned, so contracts are a very, very important thing that we must enter into. And you can stipulate that if later on in the marriage, your husband takes on a second wife, that will become an automatic talaq or whatever, because men only can give talaq. But you can include it in the contract to say that if he does that, he now hands over that right of talaq to the wife. And then I learned this at the Islamic Peace College of South Africa in Cape Town 2 weeks ago, where they said that in Yemen, they have a delayed or a deferred meher. So upon marriage, the wife would not take all her meher, she'd take a portion, and the balance, the husband would be indebted to her. So she will get that upon his death, or if he takes a polygynous wife, he enters into a polygynous marriage, then that debt must be paid to her. Because then you don't have cases like that wife who was locked up and her belongings were withheld and she wasn't given anything for her efforts in the subsistence of the marriage. Yeah, so that was the findings of the women, and I think Fatima will host the question and answer.
Subhanallah, I'm so glad I'm not married. Zohra, I want to commend you on that presentation. You said this was the graveyard shift. You need to know at Muslimah Today, there is no graveyard shift, number one. And number two, even if there was, you were so upbeat in your style of presentation that I think you've woken everyone up, alhamdulillah. Not to say that they were sleeping, because the presentation before that was equally amazing, alhamdulillah. Okay, but you went over your time, so we're cutting your Q&A. Okay, I'm only going to allow a couple of questions It's 4:08, and we need to stop at 4:15. Okay, somebody, I think Shanaz has a question. Shanaz, over there. Put your hand up again, please.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah for the most enlightening, much awaited discussion on this, really. I just needed to add that it's a good idea to have a prenup contract. You know, I think a lot of our women don't know about that. Our young teenage girls don't know about that. They could arrange something in their prenup contract where if they don't want the husband to take second wife while they're married, they can do so. And he's bound to that contract. He cannot take a woman until he divorces her or she passes away. That's it. Jazakallah.
Okay, Azra has a question. Okay, Azra has a question. You know it's been broadcast on Hilaal TV and they're focusing on you right now.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm putting my niqab on. Zohra, I just wanted to ask you on the second last slide or the last slide that you had on, there was something you had, woman and tafweed, and you didn't touch on it. And I think a lot of people don't know what the concept is. So if you could just tell us a bit about it, inshallah.
So I think that was, sorry, I didn't explain it, that the word tafweed actually meant where the wife, when the husband actually, his right of divorce is now passed on to the wife if he does not fulfill any clause in the marriage contract. One, which is if he took on he went into a polygynous marriage and took on a subsequent wife, she then has the right to talaq him.
Sorry, so does this only apply if you entered into that contract before you got married?
You can even do the contract now. And that's what I encourage women to do, because many of us here are not so like 30, 40 years. Some of us are newly married, maybe a decade, and things can change. You don't know when that can happen. And let me tell you, when you're in your courting stage, nobody talks about contract. It should be there. And something that we should encourage is premarital counseling, of which the contract will be one aspect. But I would encourage anybody, no matter how far you are in your marriage, to make up a contract.
Sorry, but Zohra, this contract doesn't just refer to polygynous marriages. It could be anything in the
Yes,
marriage.
yes. Even if you're in for other aspects, other clauses and things that you would want honored in your marriage, even if it's monogamous.
I had a WhatsApp question. The first part wasn't related to polygyny, but the second part was, it's more of a comment than a question. Some second wives don't even know that they're second wives until years down the line. Have you accounted this in your research?
Absolutely true. One of the wives that told me that when her husband approached her, he said that she must not worry. She actually wanted to go and speak to the first wife. And he told her that his first marriage is like, it's almost over, and they are filing for divorce. The proceedings are almost being concluded, so she needs not to worry. And that was as far as a participant of my study said. But I hear many, many stories like that, where sometimes the wife will even lie that he's divorced, he's not living with his wife, or that they're having problems. And you know, and one of the cases I remember where he said, no, you don't worry about that, where she had the nobility and the intention to approach the first wife and say, he's approached me to marry me. Are you happy with that? Would we be able to live together as co-wives and co-sisters? And he said, no, you don't worry about that. My wife will not be able to handle it. So I will tell her when the time is right. There was a case where the husband promised the wife, it never happened. The wife couldn't handle the fact that her husband was not giving her time, and eventually she actually left that marriage, the second marriage, because it was causing her a lot of pain and emotional and psychological harm.
This topic is addictive. I want to close the Q&A, but I can't. But I'm going to close it in a couple of minutes. Anonymous question: can you refer women to a Muslim female lawyer to help with the prenuptial contract?
Okay, so what I'm trying to do as K-Line, as Fatima introduced, that we're a non-charging, confidential counseling service. And because we work with issues of maintenance, divorce, and things like that, what I've decided is I've been speaking to the IPSA College in Cape Town. I'm trying to get the copy from the MJC. I've got a UK copy, and I want to actually work on all those documents and then have a sort of a template that we could make available online, and you can tweak it around, and add in or take out the clauses that are relevant to you. So it will be non-charged. We must try and put this onto, I think there are wills and testaments that you can get online copies. So this is what I want to do, the same thing with marriage contracts.
Okay, we have another question sent in via WhatsApp. Is there a study on men who enter into polygamous marriages, their experiences, reasons, etc.? We don't really want to know. Anyway.
No, I think it's very important. You know, when I said I'm skipping that slide, it was limitations to the study. As much as you do an intensive research, there'll always be something that you haven't covered, and that's room for further exploration. And one of the things is to have to explore the lived realities of men in these relationships. I think it can't be easy, especially for the men who do it the fair way. It can't be easy. So that was something I had put in as a recommendation, that's an area of further exploration. And I think that's the only way. If we know both sides, then we as a society can make the necessary modifications for this practice to be practiced in the right way.